So a little bit more about me and my background. As of, I think it's been almost a year or close to, I'm a research scholar here at the Ronan Institute. As of the past few months, I am the owner and director of a virtual small business, veteran research and education curation, otherwise known as the VetRec. I have a research assistant professor affiliation with the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I worked doing research administration for a veteran center for almost 4 years before I moved into the entrepreneurial space, doing what I'm doing now. And then most importantly, and probably relevant to this presentation and the work that I do, I'm a veteran of the Virginia Army National Guard. Excuse me. I do think it's relevant to share. So all of my research really focuses on and centers on veteran identity. Most of the work I do are sort of come to research with the premise that veteran identity is really at the core of many of the issues in the veteran community. So stuff like transition challenges, the veteran suicide phenomenon, which some background, the veteran suicide phenomenon has been like the #1 priority for the Department of Veterans Affairs for the past decade. It's been like an epidemic that's been happening in the community for 10 to 15 years. And so most of the research around like health research with veterans tends to lean towards solving the suicide phenomenon. So my work really focuses on identity and how identity really is at the core of most of these issues, is how I come to my research. So today I'm going to share a bit about a book that I recently published that's about veteran identity, and then talk specifically about a theory or a model of veteran identity hierarchy that I developed in that text. So some background on the book. I published Rethinking, Reintegration, and Veteran Identity, A New Consciousness in February of this year with Palgrave Macmillan. The book is written as an autoethnography. So if you're not familiar with autoethnography, it is a critical qualitative research method where the researcher writes about experiences of the self, so that's the auto part, mixed with cultural insight taken from like belonging to a specific culture or group. So in my case, it's military veteran culture, mixed with existing research and literature, so the research and writing process. So my book essentially is me writing about my own lived experiences of joining the military, serving in the military, and then separating from the military with literature about military transitions, reintegration, the veteran suicide phenomenon, and psychosocial adjustment challenges sort of woven throughout my story. And the purpose of autoethnography is not to generalize research, but rather to give readers and give the audience data and story to live with, rather than sort of more sterile findings to think about, if that makes sense. So overall, the book covers topics from, as I mentioned, transitions, reintegration, the suicide phenomenon, and psychosocial adjustment challenges. But overall, the book really focuses on and argues for understanding the social implications of veteran identity and how that relates to all of these challenges that we see within veteran communities. There's 7 chapters in the book. For the sake of time, I won't explain each chapter. I'll just kind of touch on what each chapter is. The first chapter is solely narrative. So it's a really condensed version of my story of sort of coming to joining the military, sort of how that happens, my process of going through my initial entry training, so boot camp and my job training, serving in, and then my decision-making process around separating from the military and what that experience was like for me. The second chapter is essentially the literature review, focused specifically on reintegration, military transitions, and veteran suicides, all interrelated, or like the interrelationship between all of these as it relates to veteran identity. The third chapter is my theory and methods chapter. I use Victor Turner's concept of liminality as my main theoretical framework. I also draw from Gloria Anzaldua's concept of borderlands for some theory as well, but I come to veteran identity thinking of it as being between and betwixt, and being on the borderlands of different cultures, particularly the military and the civilian cultures and institutions. So I see identity, veteran identity, as this constant negotiation of being between these different spaces. And then for the method, I already mentioned I use autoethnography, but even more specifically, I use autoarchaeology in this text, which is using institutional artifacts to ground the research in certain cultural nuances or cultural findings. So it helps to highlight or illuminate certain cultural aspects of the community in which you're talking about. And then chapters 4, 5, and 6 are sort of my data chapters. So that's where I'm really using heavy narrative and story. I'm using my own institutional artifacts from my time in the military to explain things about veteran identity as they relate to military transitions, veteran suicides, and these psychosocial adjustment challenges. And then chapter 7 is really the bread and butter, which it should be, and it is the conclusion chapter, but it's also where I introduce this new model of veteran identity hierarchy that I developed. So this is the visual of the model. There are 7 propositions that I developed to help explain the model, but rather than like reading through all of them, I just wanted to kind of explain it for the sake of time again. First, how I came to develop this model. I started to notice, so I've done work in veteran spaces since I left the military in 2014. So I've worked in like community outreach in the nonprofit space with veteran communities. I've worked with veteran spaces and centers in higher education for, since 2014. And so I've noticed a pattern working with veterans in myself and in other veterans. And it's a tendency to qualify our military service. So I do this a lot myself. My own experience of military service doesn't fit into the dominant narrative. So my unit never deployed to war while I was serving in the National Guard. And post 9/11 era, the dominant narrative around military service is definitely related to war and more specifically combat experiences. So for me in particular, when I got out of the military, at first I didn't identify as a veteran at all. But even after I started to identify as a veteran, I would always qualify my service. So yeah, I served in the National Guard, but my unit never deployed. And I thought that was just something that I did. But then when I started interacting with other veterans, I noticed other veterans doing it too, particularly veterans that have deployed to war. Yeah, I deployed, but I was only in Kuwait. I didn't actually see combat. Even veterans that did see combat. Yeah, I saw combat in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it was only one tour. I didn't do 2 or 3 tours like, many other guys that I know. And then even them, yeah, I saw combat, I did several tours, but I wasn't injured. Or I know people who were killed in action. So I noticed this pattern, in my interactions, but also in some of the research I was doing. So in some surveys and interviews, some themes around qualifying service would show up without looking for it. So that was sort of the premise of developing this model. And then I drew from several other models related to, or theories related to veteran identity or transition, theories of adaptation and transition to develop the model. The whole premise of the model basically proposes that there's this invisible hierarchy of veteran identity that exists within the veteran community. In that your military experiences, which is the left part of the model, and your individual identity characteristics interrelate to determine where you're at on this hierarchy. And then where you're at on this hierarchy influences your own relationship to veteran identity, which then consequently influences how much support you might seek out, what type of veteran communities you might join, what resources you might avail yourself to. And something that we know in research now is that veterans who strongly identify with the veteran identity are less likely to experience suicide ideation. So that's important and that's relevant to this model because sort of the lower you are on the hierarchy, the less likely you are to really identify with the veteran, the more resistant you are, the more identity conflict that you're experiencing, the more likely you are to be susceptible to higher suicide ideation, more psychosocial adjustment challenges, et cetera. So on the left side of the model, we have military experiences. Well, let me back up first. The apex is our KIA, our killed in action, Gold Star veterans. So that this is an actual term in the Department of Defense and the VA. We have Gold Star families. So these are people who have lost a loved one, lost somebody to combat in the military. This is really the apex, right? This is the Gold Star of veteran identity. And it's important, sort of the cultural piece behind it, to understand the conditioning and acculturation that sort of goes into joining the military. The military is a very collectivist institution. There's a quote by author and veteran advocate Sebastian Junger that says, "Who you are in the military depends entirely on your ability to surrender who you are." So let me say that again. Who you are in the military depends entirely on your ability to surrender who you are. So it's this selflessness, right? It's putting everybody else in country, freedom, military missions, whatnot, before individual needs and selfhood. So the apex is the ultimate surrendering of self, literally, right? So being killed in action. And then on the left, we have all these military experiences that sort of create this hierarchy of how much of the individual self really has been sacrificed or sort of given up in service to the military institution. At the top of the apex, or not the top, but closest to KIA, we have visually injured from combat. This is where you can literally see war on the body, right? So people that have experienced an amputation have a visible physical injury from war, right? So they're wearing war on their body, it's visible. Under this, we're gonna have, several combat tours, maybe people that were invisibly injured, so traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, military sexual trauma. There's a lot of invisible injuries, and those are much more prevalent with the post-9/11 generation than earlier generations. And then under that, never saw combat, maybe weren't active duty, a dishonorable or other than honorable discharge. So this list is not fully inclusive, but it gives you an idea of this sort of hierarchy, right, of different experiences that you can have in terms of how much of the self am I surrendering for the military institution? How close am I getting to that full surrendering of self, the apex? And then on the right, we have individual identity characteristics. If you know anything about the US military, you know that it has not always been the most inclusive organization, right? Particularly as it relates to gender, for example. So there was a ban on transgender service members. Women in particular have been barred from certain roles in the military, specifically combat roles. Up until 2016, the combat arms policy was lifted for women, and then in the years since, women have integrated more. But what's important about this is that not everybody has always had access to the roles on the left side of the model that would grant one access to a higher status on this hierarchy, right? So both of these things, the military experiences and your individual identity characteristics, interrelate to determine where you're going to be at on that hierarchy. And then where you're at on that hierarchy, again, influences your relationship with your veteranness, and your relationship with your veteranness impacts whether I'm going to join this veteran organization, I'm going to seek out services, whether I'm even eligible for services from the Department of Veterans Affairs, whether I'm going to go for a free dinner at Ruby Tuesdays on Veterans Day, whatever it is, but it influences my interactions, the way that I'm navigating that space of in-betweenness as a veteran. And then kind of the so what here. Why does this matter? Kind of to conclude it. So again, currently only certain types of military experiences qualify one for veteran status, and then consequently facilitates access, to benefits, particularly as it relates to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Veterans with a strong sense of veteran identity are less likely to exhibit suicide ideation. I argue that everyone who serves in the military falls short of the ultimate sacrifice. Everyone who survives military service falls short, right? So we've survived, we weren't killed in action. And then as a result, we experience some level of identity conflict. And that level of identity conflict, I believe, is mediated by what your military experiences were and what your individual identity characteristics are. And then that influences, what are the challenges? What are those psychosocial adjustment difficulties that we face when we leave the military institution? Veterans as a population, we experience mental health challenges more than non-veterans. So I talked about the suicide phenomenon, but also substance use disorders are higher in the veteran community. Levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD rates, so post-traumatic stress disorder, are higher in veterans than in non-veterans. And then ultimately, the more we understand veteran identity, which I mentioned in the beginning, I come to all of this research with identity being at the core of what I see being the main issue in many of the challenges that veterans face. The more we understand it, the more we can create and implement policies and programs and services that are more inclusive, and that help to foster peace and resiliency in this population.